Good morning. I'm Diane Jordan, Director of Christian Education with Pleasant Hill United Methodist Church in Indian Land, South Carolina. Thank you for joining me today for our Adult Sunday School lesson on this beautiful Sunday morning, October 11th in the year 2020. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the rest of the book of Esther. We started last week by an introduction to the characters and the time period, and now this week we're going to be looking at the story that takes place. And this is a historical account of true events that really happened about 500 years before the birth of Christ. These events are truly important to both the Christian and Jewish faiths because the purpose of Haman's actions was to completely annihilate the Jewish population. Had that event occurred, there would have been no Jesus Christ, no Savior. And also to remind you, this story takes place in Susa, which is in Persia, which is also now Iran. And in it, we have King Xerxes, and he is the most powerful and influential leader in the world at this time. He rules a vast empire. He has enormous power and enormous wealth. His queen is Vashti, and we don't hear a lot about her. They don't tell us very much about her. Later in the story, the King Xerxes will appoint a man named Haman as his sort of a prime minister. And then we have Mordecai and Esther. Mordecai is a Jewish man. We believe he worked in some capacity as an official for the palace. And he raises his young cousin Esther, who is orphaned at a young age. And so our story begins in the beginning. There's a feast that Xerxes holds for all the military leaders of Persia and Media, as well as all the princes and nobles of the provinces of his Persian Empire. And this is a men-only event. And it's been learned from Persian inscriptions that the feast was held in preparation for Xerxes' famous expedition against the Greeks. So this feast is taking place about 3 years into Xerxes' reign. And for a full 180 days, Xerxes displays the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and the glory of his majesty, as recorded in Esther 1:4. Xerxes then holds a 7-day-long banquet in the beautifully enclosed gardens of the king's palace. And this place was fancy. The garden is decorated lavishly, and there are couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pattern of marble and mother of pearl and other costly stones. This description is recorded for us in Esther 1:6. Xerxes has spared no expense in the entertaining of his guests, and he has a virtual smorgasbord of foods that are presented to all of his guests, and wine, which is served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions. The king had ordered that all the men would be served whatever they wanted. Now note that this is a party for the men only. Now, at the same time, Queen Vashti is holding a banquet. We don't know anything about her banquet. We don't know if hers also lasted 7 days. We don't know if hers was held in a beautiful garden with all these riches and finery and smorgasbords of foods. We only know that she also held a banquet for the women at this time. On the 7th day of the festival, the Bible records that the king was in high spirits with wine. So he's undoubtedly intoxicated, and he orders his 7 male eunuch servants to bring the queen wearing her crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. I find it very interesting that the name of these 7 eunuchs are actually listed in the biblical account of this story. Well, Queen Vashti refuses to appear. Was it because she had her own guests and her own banquet to attend to? Or was it because she really didn't want to parade around looking her beautiful best and wearing her crown in front of a bunch of men who had been drinking for 7 days? We don't know why. It only states in the Bible that she refuses. Xerxes becomes enraged. If he can't control his own wife and in front of the military leaders of his empire, then how are his men going to follow him? He takes it as a personal affront, both to himself as her husband and especially to himself as her king. And one of his advisors states that Queen Vashti's actions will become known to all the women, to ignore the disobedience of the queen, which sent a signal to all wives that they need not unwillingly obey their husbands. That would create disrespect and discord and thus destroy the male authority that is prominent at this time period. Xerxes calls a conference of his 7 closest advisors, and the seriousness of the crisis that they're facing is highlighted when they decide that Vashti has to go. She has to be replaced by a more submissive woman. And so Xerxes issues a royal decree which can never be repealed, because remember, we learned last week, once a king issues a decree, it can never be repealed. And he basically divorces Vashti. She is banished. We don't know what happens to Vashti. Is she exiled? Is she hanged? Is she locked away someplace? We don't know. Again, this book doesn't record a lot of information about her. But Xerxes has a decree sent to all 127 of his provinces so that women in his empire will continue to respect their husbands. And he states clearly in the decree that every man shall be ruler of his own household. Well, after Xerxes recovers from his drunkenness and his anger, he feels remorse about what he's done. But again, he can't undo this. He needs a queen. So how is he going to go about finding a new one? Well, again, these trusted personal attendants, some people actually believe they were some sort of astrologers. They were summoned to a conference, and they proposed a search for the most beautiful young virgins to be brought to the palace and prepared for the king's evaluation. Now, before a young woman had a turn to spend a night with the king, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments, 6 months of treatments with oil of myrrh, and 6 months of treatments with perfumes and cosmetics. This selection process netted a number of beautiful girls, and one of those girls was Hadassah, who later would receive a new name of Esther. Esther received special treatment from the servant in charge of the harem because she pleased him and won his favor, as recorded in Esther 2:9. Mordecai took the precaution to instruct his young cousin, who he's raising as his own daughter, not to reveal her ethnic identity. The first hint that we have in this story that there's some sort of racial prejudice in Susa against the Jewish people. So the king had his own method of evaluating the young women that are brought to the palace. He spent the night with each girl before he made his decision and offered his opinion. Once the girl spent the night with the king, she was removed to a separate section of the harem. She was not any longer with the other virgins awaiting their turn. When Esther's turn came, the king was attracted to Esther more than any other young woman, and he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen. Shortly after Esther is made queen, Mordecai uncovers a plot by 2 officials to assassinate Xerxes, and he reports it to Esther, who reports it to the king immediately. The 2 officials are executed, and the royal court dutifully records the details of the plot, the punishment, and gives credit where it's due, which is to Mordecai, who basically has saved the king's life. Shortly after this event, Haman is promoted to the position similar to a prime minister. He is sort of now the number 2 guy in the kingdom. And all the officials now, by commands of the king, are to bow down to Haman. But Mordecai doesn't. And the fact that Mordecai customarily refuses to bow down to Haman infuriates Haman. Now, the fact that Mordecai customarily sits at the palace gates indicates that he holds an important position in the government at this time. And the gates are the places where the legal transactions and business takes place. And it's also a really good place to overhear conversations in the people. So fellow officials see Mordecai refusing to bow down to Haman, and they report his lack of showing honor to Haman, and they identify to Haman that Mordecai is Jewish. Well, fierce anger overtakes Haman, and it burns until he decides not only to have Mordecai executed, but to annihilate his people as well. Annihilate. So, With like-minded friends, he sits down together and they cast lots to determine a proper time to have the Jewish population annihilated. And the lots designated the month of Adar, which is in February or March of our calendar year, and it's almost a year later. So Haman waits, and he presents a report of serious threat to the well-being of the empire to the king. He says that an unnamed people have customs that have caused them to disobey the king's laws, and that such lawlessness should never be tolerated. Haman even offers to pay the cost, which amounts to an equivalent of about 375 tons in silver in today's world. Haman suggests that they issue a royal decree authorizing the destruction of these lawless people. Xerxes, following the advice of his prime minister, issues the decree, and it's immediately written and distributed throughout the empire. So Haman's celebrating after this. He's having wine with the king, and the king, remember, has issued now a decree, and this decree cannot be altered. It cannot be revoked. And now Haman is ecstatic. His enemies, Mordecai, cannot escape. The people of Susa were actually bewildered when this decree came out. Who were these people with such customs that they would defy the commands of the king? When Mordecai heard the royal heralds read the decree publicly, his heart was broken. How could his people escape this destruction? Unable to contain his emotions, he tore his clothes. He robed himself in sackcloth, which is a rough burlap kind of material to wear, and rubbed himself with ashes. And he roamed the streets of Susa, wailing loudly and bitterly. And Jews all across the empire did the same. This easily identified the people that the decree was against, the Jewish people. And now they feel as though the death of all Jews is certain. And it's very interesting to note that in the royal decree, the Jewish words are translated exactly into destroyed, killed, and annihilated. When word comes to Esther about what Mordecai is doing, she's absolutely puzzled. She has no idea about this decree. She sends clothes to Mordecai and asks him to put them on, and he refuses. So Mordecai has an attendant go and send to Esther a copy of the published decree, and also give instructions for him to read it to Esther. It could be that it's in one language and Esther reads another. Mordecai makes sure that he charges her to entreat the king for the mercy of the people. And Mordecai's previous command that Esther conceal her identity as a Jew is now being reversed. In Xerxes' palace, however, a person has to be summoned to appear before the king. If you appear before the king, even if you are his wife, his queen, and you haven't had an invitation, if he doesn't extend his royal gold scepter to you, you are immediately put to death. Well, Esther contemplates all of this, and she's concerned because the king hasn't requested her to visit him in over 30 days. And I'd like to read to you Esther 4:12 through 17, and how Esther replies to Mordecai, and how Mordecai replies to Esther. Now, Mordecai knows what he's asking of Esther. He knows that she can be executed for appearing before him. And she's concerned about that, and she tells Mordecai she's concerned about that. But Mordecai sends back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And our most famous line from Esther, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Then Esther replies to Mordecai, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Esther has decided that she will act on behalf of her people. And she knows that she may be killed. But she decides that she has to do as Mordecai has asked her and try to protect her people. And she asks everyone to fast for 3 days. And that's an unusually long fast. And that points and shows us the seriousness of the situation. And it also contrasts very nicely with the feasts that the king throws for every other event. So Esther decides to approach the throne. And can you imagine how frightened she must have been? She goes to Xerxes and he extends his gold scepter. He was in a good mood that day. Thankfully, he had not been drinking. And the king even offered Esther half of his kingdom if she wanted it. But her request was brief. She just invited Xerxes and Haman to a banquet she had prepared. They went to the banquet. Haman left in high spirits. He's an important man. Man, he's getting invited to dine alone with the queen and the king. So when Mordecai walks through the king's gate, when Haman walks through the king's gate, Mordecai is still there, and Haman is just enraged. He brags to his wife and his friends about his important to King Xerxes and Queen Esther, and he's still aggravated that Mordecai is not bowing to him. So Haman's friends had a solution. Why don't you go ahead and build the gallows to hang Mordecai on? Some translations speak of a pole and impalement. The translation I read from talked about a gallows. So that night, Xerxes could not sleep, and he ordered that the daily government records be read to him. And he noted that Mordecai had never been rewarded for saving his life. So the next day, Haman arrives at the palace, and he's going to ask for permission to execute Mordecai. But before he can speak, Xerxes asks him for his opinion. He wants to bestow honor on a person who has benefited the king. Haman's thinking, hot dog, they are going to parade me through the streets. That's what I want. So he says he wants to wear the king's robes. He doesn't say he. He says the man should wear the king's robes and ride on the king's horse and be paraded through town and all of that. And Haman is absolutely dumbfounded when the king says, great, make it happen, you do it, and Mordecai is the man I want to honor. He has to do what the king tells him to do. But can you imagine how angry he must have been? Soon as he's done with this, he goes home and he pours out his grief to his wife and his friends, and they were shocked. And they finally tell Haman in Esther 6:13, you cannot stand against him. You surely will come to ruin. So they're warning him against his threat to Mordecai and his trying to eliminate Mordecai, but he doesn't listen. Xerxes is intrigued by Esther's delaying tactics, so during the banquet, he keeps requesting that she state her petition, and she says, if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. She tells him that if her people had been sold into slavery, she would have never bothered him. It would have been too much to justify, or too little to justify disturbing the king. Xerxes is furious, and he demands to know the name of the man who would destroy her. And Esther replies, an adversary and enemy, this vile Haman. Well, the impact is dramatic. Xerxes leaves the table in a rage. He goes out into his garden to think for a moment, and Haman's terrified. He goes to beg mercy to Esther. And as he does that, Esther's sitting on this couch. He falls onto the couch just at the moment that Xerxes walks back into the room. Xerxes says, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in this house? And it's really interesting to see that he is now having to bow down to Esther. He is now trying to bow down to Esther. However, he's angry because Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. So guards immediately arrest and blindfold Haman, and he is taken to the gallows and executed immediately. There's more in Esther, but we're running out of time this morning, so I will share those with you next week. We'll wrap up the end of Esther next week, and I'll also talk next week about the celebration, the Festival of Purim, which is a celebration that the Jewish faith still celebrates today to mark the events in this book of Esther. Thanks for joining me this morning. I hope you're enjoying this study as much as I have. See you next week. God bless.